Hello, everyone, and welcome to 9-Inch Charge. Welcome. This is not really an old world show. It's a bit combined, really. This is a bit of a... I don't know what to call this.
It's a really old world show.
Yeah, a really, really old world show. So Jeremy and I have been looking back to the 3rd edition rulebook and looking at all the races that existed then that don't exist today, either in Warhammer Fantasy Battles or in Warhammer Age of Sigmar. And we're going to go on a bit of a trip down memory lane. We're going to go and have a look at all these races that no longer exist and have a think about what they could be like if Games Workshop were to bring them back. So we've highlighted 6. We're going to do 3 each. And then after we've done that, we're going to delve further into the bestiary and talk about giant frogs and giant snails and leeches and all these other kinds of strange creatures and beasties that that lived in the old world. Jeremy, why don't you kick us off? What's your first choice of unit that you would like to see back or that you think is interesting that we don't have anymore?
Yeah, it was definitely a bit of a colourful dive back into the 3rd edition book because we've never seen it before. But the one that really stood out to me was probably the elementals. So really kind of what you'd think when you think of those classic elementals. So there used to be rules for earth, air, fire, and water elementals. They sound like they're kind of like sort of independent force that can be sort of summoned up to the table. This could be completely wrong with going into the book, but then you can sort of power them around the table, and they will way of sort of combining and sort of capturing the magic of the warp onto the physical world of the old world. Kind of a bit like a demon is sort of like plays host to actual magical forces itself and sort of solidified within to operate in the world. But it had some really, really interesting rules, like the fact that they were unstable. Which made sense, but they were completely magical beings.
What's interesting about the elementals is that they only represent 4 elements, but we know what I would quite like to see if they were to bring them back in some way is that we know that there are 8 major winds of magic, and if they're representing magic coming out of the warp, you know, why couldn't we have one that, okay, we've got a fire one, but why couldn't we have a heavens one and a beasts one and all the rest of this kind of stuff? And this is a little bit like what they're trying to do in Age of Sigmar at the moment, where you won't know this, Jeremy, but at the moment, Age of Sigmar is set in the realm of beast, and every realm has its own, is a representation of a law of magic. And now it turns out that there are these incarnates. And we used to have the incarnates. Forge World made a couple of incarnates. You may remember them. There was an incarnate of Beast, and now there's a new one, the incarnate of Gur. And I wonder if the elementals might be superseded by something that is a representation of the law of a law of magic. And they might, instead of being 4, they could expand on them and make 8.
I mean, that sounds like a really nice way actually of Games Workshop like being able to put their stamp on it, because the thing about having to 4 basic elementals is it's slightly cliched. It's kind of thing that we've seen before in different forms of media, but actually be able to like have like, I don't know, a dedicated elemental for shadow or life or death or whatever it get to be. You can sort of really put you know, that sort of Games Workshop sort of grimdark spin on it, which would be really cool.
I think this just shows that the game grew out of Dungeons and Dragons, doesn't it? Really.
Yeah, I think it's a theme that we've kind of seen all along this. You've got lots of different subspecies that we come on to in a bit, which makes sense from a role-playing point of view, but don't really kind of make sense from like the mechanics of how to do a war game as such. But I think you make a really good point actually about how Age of Sigmar's currently doing things. And I wonder whether maybe the elementals, if they brought them back, could be spun off like the end of spells that we've currently got, and whether that could be sort of like another way of taking it forward and making it really interesting.
I think there were some elementals. I might be wrong about this, but I swear that there were some in the Chaos Dwarf army.
There was the Forge World army had these. They were like flaming demons held down by chains with sort of like armor wrapped around them. They were quite cool.
The Kadai FIREBORN, and they are demonic fire elementals. So there were actually a unit of them that came at the end, and they're really, really, really cool models. So then you could begin to see how an army might look rather than having one spun off, which is kind of cool. I think, for me, I think you're right, Jeremy, that they kind of feel like they could be like an endless spell, like they could be summoned onto the table as part of an army rather than be an army on their own. But a lot of the things that we're talking about and a lot of things that appear in the Bestiary in 3rd edition are like that. So mummies get their own section and tree men get their own section and things like that. But we know that actually they're part of a larger combined force. But yeah, I do remember the models actually for the elementals. Like, I remember thinking that they were cool.
I think I might maybe seen in an old edition of White Dwarf or something, or maybe like brought back in like a vintage section. But yeah, they were actually quite nice. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go next, and I'm going to pick the Femir. And the Femir they're really interesting, and they're pretty brutal actually. So I'm just going to read the flavor text here that is for them. So the Femir haunt bogs, fens, and desolate moorlands throughout the northern and western Old World. Their strongholds take the form of forbidding craggy piles of rock, crudely built in resemblance of human castles. All Femir settlements are wreathed in a thick mist, a miasma which is magically generated by the Femir in order to shield them from sunlight. Indeed, when forced to travel beyond their fortress, they surround themselves in this enchanted mist, and it moves with them. And that's played out in the rules. If you get 5 or more in a unit, they get this mist rule, which is really cool. And then I was reading further, and they take a much darker turn, actually. So the warriors of the Femir or Fim are a scourge to human settlements along the coast of the Old World. The Femir are obliged to raid and carry off captives in order to perpetuate themselves, for there are no fertile Femir females, and all Femir are the result of a union between a Femir and a captive human woman.
Someone spent a little bit too much time thinking this one through, didn't they, really?
But that's very, very dark, that they creep upon like towns and cities as this mist, and they steal all the women and capture them and bring them back. I mean, you know, people talk about, there was a big talk about Slaanesh was kind of missing from the Mortal Realms when Age of Sigmar happened. And they were saying, oh, well, is Games Workshop trying to shy away from this kind of thing? And then when Slaanesh came out, there was like really disgusting models of a guy who's like, basically like his back had been opened up and then like spines had been put in and they play a harp out his back and things like that. But I don't know how far down the way of, you know, being forced to mate with a horrible Femir creature they would go. But I really like the idea that they're kind of like cruder versions of humans who kind of try their best to make these cobbled together castles and things, and then they have this really weird mist that they cast around themselves. And like, if you see a creeping mist, like, and you're a human living in any town, like in the Empire or something, you'd be bloody worried.
Yeah, I think the mist idea is really strong. It's quite dark. It's quite atmospheric, I suppose, to say the obvious. I think there's always a problem when you start to do games like using like sexual assault as a game mechanic, especially considering that Games Workshop doesn't actually have a very good track record of introducing women in a positive role, which doesn't seem designed purely for the male gaze. So that's what makes me wince slightly at the end of
They're much better at it now, actually. There's some really cool female Stormcast models and things like this that are coming out, and in Warcry they're like female barbarians, and they're done really, really well. And they're not, I know, you know, I know who I'm talking to. I know who my audience is. I know that all the women in your Dark Elf army are scantily clad and wearing their metal bikinis and things. But there are other models out there where they do portray women in a more realistic kind of light, where they are like getting their hands dirty and they fight alongside the men in just the same kind of way. It does talk about the women in the Femir society, because they what's interesting about them is that they actually are the rulers of the society. So they're the witch queens, and they're really powerful wizards, and they do rule over the society. Like I said, they are revered, but the problem is they just can't perpetuate the species. They're all kind of like mules, I suppose. Is it mules that can't?
Oh yeah, they can't have offspring. Yeah, yes, I think. That's the best subtitle. So the misty mules. Okay.
Yeah, they're misty mules. So yeah, if a Femi unit has 5 more models, it generates its own covering mist, and then they're -1 to hit by shooting. and enemies are able to return only the vaguest details of the Femir until they're quite close, and then until an enemy model is within 12 inches of that unit, you can keep any character models associated with that unit hidden off the table, and then they come on when they're close enough to see them. So you don't know where the heroes and things are in the units until you get right up to them. But they're not very good in the daylight. They prefer it in the mist, and they prefer it in their crags and places underground and things. So if you fight the unit back to a point where it loses its mist, they suffer from stupidity.
That's cool.
Yeah. So all that kind of stuff is very good. I think if they were to tweak the other lore that we spoke about slightly, I think they'd be really interesting. And they've got a really interesting aesthetic as well. And I think they're another one where there were models made for them at one point. So you never know what they might do with them. But I think the mist thing they've kind of incorporated now into the hobgoblins. Because in Age of Sigmar, the hobgoblins have a mist that they go along, and they've got these big scare face shields that are brightly coloured, and then out of the mist, all you see is these brightly coloured, like, horrible faces, and then you know that they're upon you. So I think they've tried to combine that into the hobgoblins, and the hobgoblins are an army that I guess have recently come back in Age of Sigmar. We're not going to talk about them in this video because I think they deserve having a dedicated video about them just on their own, because they're now forming quite a big part of the map, and they've been mentioned a few times in the articles. So we won't mention them today. But that was my first pick. That was the Femir.
So I'm going to talk a bit about Norse dwarfs now, which I thought was a really interesting one, looking back on it, just to see that they had actually had this split in the dwarf race. So you usually just think about them as being, chaos dwarfs and normal dwarfs, but actually just have a third variety I thought was really cool. So as the name suggests, they inhabit the mountains of Nausicaa, the lands north of the Sea of Claws. And they're actually living alongside the human Norsemen, and they're described actually as being very similar in nature to the humans, of being rather barbaric and aggressive, of loving drinking and fighting, and sort of having very sort of similar styles of like dress and war gear. One of the things that really jumped out at me was the fact that they are a seafaring race, and actually that they had colonies around Lustria and the New World, which kind of obviously is playing very heavily kind of into that sort of that Viking sort of aesthetic. And that it goes to actually the look of them as well, being kind of like more pale skinned, sort of red haired. So you've got that sort of like Celtic vibe coming from them really strongly. It's also really interesting to actually see that you can see the origins of some of the Slayers, Slayer models that we're so familiar with now, and particularly got beloved characters like Gotrex in there. So as well as having normal warriors, they're described as having sort of several special cult warriors, including Berserkers, Troll Slayers, and Giant Slayers. So it's really cool actually to see the origins of like the Slayers going all the way back to 3rd edition as well. And actually, this is clearly its own separate faction, which is kind of then sort of like merged and amalgamated into the main dwarf range as well. So I thought that was kind of cool.
What is really cool about the Norse dwarves is that not only do they travel to different places, I mean that is kind of, that gives you a bit of free reign. If you were going to write them back into the game, you could say anything. They dug down, they found a new kind of metal, or they found this and that, and then
there's a new colony on the other side of the world. They got cut off and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and actually they are cut off. So when you get to the end times, I know you don't like talking about the end times, Jeremy, and it isn't canon to you, but when you get to the end times, the Norse dwarves get a very little mention, and there are Norse dwarves, even in the old world, that have been cut off from the normal dwarves for so long. And then you think, well, they wouldn't have all this new stuff, would they? I think they would have black powder, but they wouldn't have things like gyrocopters and things like that. And then it would just be really fascinating to see what they are like, and and how their ancestor worship goes, and how it differs, and all the different runes that they might have discovered. So I think that's really cool. And I liked what you said about it's nice that there's a third race, because obviously with the elves, I collected the third race. You got your high and your dark, and then you got your wood elves. So I think that's cool. I would like to see in the background seafaring dwarves would be brilliant. I tell you what would be really cool on one of those boats is when they're rowing along. I want to know what the Norse dwarf drinking songs are.
I was just thinking that I had a vision of like a slightly drunk dwarf just hanging out of a long ship, and that made me very happy. And let's have long ships back, please. That'll do.
And actually, Vikings and things like that are very kind of in now, I suppose, is what you would say. Whereas I think when this was written, although it would have been cool, I think now there's a lot more people interested in Norse mythology and things like that than I can remember at any other time. So I think it'd be a good chance for them to bring them back, which I think brings us on. We've spoken about the Norse dwarfs, so why don't we talk about the Norse men?
Good.
I do actually have to find where the Norsemen are in the book, though, because I was hovering over the gnomes.
Well, while you're finding that, I'm just gonna add something else. I think it's a good chance that maybe we'll get Norse factions back into the game, because we've seen obviously them be their own playable faction in the Total War series as well. So have things like mammoths as well. So it feels like a great opportunity for GW to like introduce a new faction. I can continue to talk if you found the page that you're after.
I found it, but I was interested in what you were saying. I was just imagining a giant war mammoth with like runes carved into its tusks and things like that. I think that would be amazing to see. But no, I found the Norsemen.
Cool.
So they come under humans in the Bestiary in 3rd edition, and it says a special mention must be made to the Norse. These humans live in the north of the old world, in the chaos-racked lands of Norsca. They sail all over the world in their somber dragon boats. So kind of similar to like I said, there's a lot of similarities there. They do have this Viking aesthetic, and they do ride their long boats. They're called dragon boats here. Raiding and trading, pillaging and exploring. Norsemen are a common sight in the northern part of the old world, and their long ships are frequently seen in the harbours of Kislev and the Empire. They are respected as mighty fighters, brave warriors, and tireless adventurers. They're also inclined to drunkenness, boasting, and fighting amongst themselves. They're very strong-minded and physically vigorous people, but they are superstitious and rather suspicious of new inventions. Their gods are deities of battle, and their warriors amongst the most ferocious in the world. Insane battle berserkers are encouraged, and wolf-like shapeshifters are also accepted, so that their armies may contain some very exotic troops. And it does go on to talk about the wares. So, and it says an army may include wolf warriors. Wolf warriors are also wares and are capable of assuming wolf form, but which fight as wolf men, half wolf and half man. See wares below. So we spoke about these before, didn't we? I just read the opening sentence and I was a bit like, So it says, wares are creatures of human origin, where they are like humans in all respects, except that they are able to assume the form of a wolf. And I'm thinking, that is a very, very big difference.
We were having this chat before about the way this book has been written, and it just feels like sometimes the emphasis isn't quite in the right place.
Yeah. If I said, oh, he's like a human in all respects, turns into a wolf, but...
Apart from that, regular chap, you know.
Yeah. What is really interesting is the next line, actually, and this is something we didn't speak about off camera, is that it is quite likely that it evolved from mutations of the standard human type, although it is remotely possible that the wares represent a slan genetic experiment of some kind. Which is really interesting. They hunger for the need for flesh, and they are only comfortable if able to regularly transmute and feed in their non-human form. So they're really interesting. Like I said, they carry different forms, and they have different base sizes depending on what they look like. And they can turn into giant wolves, or they can turn into a wolf man, or they can be a human. A really interesting unit type that I think I'd like to see them back over the Norse dwarves in a way, but obviously I'd want to see them combine over the Norse men in a way, because I'd like to see them combined. But I think they're just really fascinating that you have these shapeshifters, and I think their mechanic, it might work. We do have units that have got different forms. I'm thinking about horrors, for example.
Well, like dryads, I guess, used to be able to be shapeshifters, didn't they?
Yeah, but I think if you read the rules here, it's not just a rule that's on their war scroll or what have you, because actually they've got a different base when they turn into a giant wolf, so they become something a bit bigger, and they actually transform. Whereas when a dryad shapeshifts, it's kind of just all contained within the model.
But let's just stop and think about the arguments that would emerge from if you had to change base side mid-combat. Just stop and just take that in for a second, because that is beautiful and awful.
Oh, well, we used to argue about how many we had within base-to-base contact and
All
what
the
does the flank
time.
look like. You'd be like, right, I've got a flank charge on you. No, you haven't, because I've just transformed and now my flank is smaller.
Be amazing, yeah.
Yeah, so they are a pick for me, and I think you're right. I think we will see Norse back because they're in Total War. They're a really interesting faction. Vikings are cool, and we'd like to see that. And also, you know, they've got these wild men with a berserker rage who have eaten too much mushroom stew, and then they've got these wares that are a really interesting part of the army as well. So lots of cool stuff that they could do there. How about you, Jeremy? What's your next pick?
Well, I think my next pick has got to be the old faithful halflings. So something that probably most people who are familiar with Warhammer will be aware of. But halflings, they're essentially hobbits. They come from an area of the Empire called the Moots, which is obviously the Shire. And they're a peaceful race with a very pastoral existence, and they live in prosperous lands. They basically probably live in the nicest part of the old world that you could possibly find, where more or less nothing really bad happens. Apart from actually just say being raided by goblins, so not 100% great. But they're not the best fighters, and their claim to military renown is as baggage guards as well as cooks. There were some great rules here for them. So
an army marches on its stomach, and if you've got a halfling cook, your army is going to be marching well.
Yeah, and fighting better as well. But yeah, because they're really short, so they struggle to ride horses. So described as happily bouncing along the back of a small placid pony. Quite like the idea, just having a placid pony on the table. And they get no charge bonuses because they're just not strong enough really to do any extra impacts as well. There's a bit of a nice crossover there with wood elves, so they're sort of really apt at fighting in woodland and sort of being amongst nature, so they can travel through a wooded area without suffering any movement penalties, just like wood elves can, which I thought was quite a nice move. And also it just mentions their magic, so being a neutral power does certain things they couldn't do, like they can't use necromantic magic, or and they've got limitations on how many demonic spells they can cast as well. So yeah, no mention at this early stage of the halfling hot pot catapult. But yeah, sort of friendly.
I used to own a halfling hot pot catapult as part of an Empire army that I had, and it was. I tell you what, they've got brilliant models, the halflings, because they're back as well in Blood Bowl. There's a halfling team, and they've carried on that theme that they're cooks, and in the halfling team they've got little pasties, which I think is just brilliant.
I thought they had hot dogs as well. Have I made it up?
They do have hot dogs as well, but the pasty is the most important, and I think it would be great to see them. I would quite happily see them, kind of like how in the Orcs and Goblins book, goblins are like a massive faction. I'd love to see that, but I think the way they're written in the lore, because they only come from one small part, and actually the Empire army, it doesn't rate them particularly well. As you said, they guard the baggage and they ride the pack mules and ponies and they cook the food. You won't see a lot of them in the army, but the halfling hot pot catapult was a great model and really fun, and just goes back to how characterful things in the old world could be.
And just brings back that comedy element of it, which
I think exactly that.
I would think it'd be great to have even like a small, I don't know, division of halflings that you could include into an Empire force if you wanted to.
Well, it talks about slingers in the book and how they're really adept at slinging, and you can add range to them compared to normal men because that's what they're really good at. And also, you could use them as scouts if they're really good in woodlands and things like that, and they're quite small, so maybe they'd be less easy to detect. They would have a place, I think, but they just wouldn't. They're not going to go toe to toe with a demigriff knight, are they? Let's be honest.
They're not going to be in the front line. But yeah, I like the idea that they maybe they could do like a sort of better form of a scout. That'd be quite cool. And yeah, you're right. They described as being excellent natural shots with all thrown weapons and things. Yeah.
There we go. All right. So I want to talk about another short and stumpy race. I would like to talk about the gnomes. So, the gnomes are relatives of the dwarves, and they share a similar cultural background, language, and temperament. As far as anyone knows, gnomes have always lived alongside the dwarves, and in their own distinct settlements, and never mixing with their larger cousins. Hang on, let me read that again. Gnomes have always lived alongside the dwarves, although in their own distinct settlements and never mixing with their larger cousins. So how is that really alongside?
I think they have a settlement. There's like a line down the sand, and no one crosses it.
Oh my god! I don't know if anyone will get this reference, but if you've ever seen Steptoe and Son, it's about a father and son who live together, and there's an episode where they fall out. And they draw a line down the middle of the living room, and and the TV's got the controls on it because it's quite old. And one half, they've got half the TV each, but one side's got the controls, and they can choose what to watch. And I think that might be what it's like. I don't know how I've ended up with it, but I've ended up with a second race where they talk about the sexual habits of them.
I'm saying nothing.
So it says here, it's not known whether gnomes and dwarves interbreed. Few people would dare quiz a member of either race on their sexual habits. It is, however, doubtful, as both races are proud and independent. But there is nothing guaranteed to annoy a gnome more than mistaking him for a dwarf. There are a few that live amongst human society. Some of them come down and will trade and live in the cities. They're really good at magic and things like that. They're just an interesting take and a new unit that could go into any kind of dwarf army. As it says, they're wizards, master wizards, because dwarves don't use magic, and obviously we know they've got the runes and they can have the anvil and they can smash that, but they've always shied away from using magic, and this opens that up to the dwarves potentially.
They also very much feel like a race where it kind of made more sense within that sort of RPG context. Like if you play D&D, you can play a gnome, and they are quite distinct from playing a dwarf as well. So I feel like there's that distinction in that. Apart from maybe having the opportunity to introduce magic to a dwarf army, potentially there wasn't that huge sort of distinction there. So you kind of understand how over time maybe they were sort of folded together.
I think what would be interesting is if you've got them in an army together and it says that they are quite distinct and they live quite separate lives, maybe you would say that a gnome can't use the leadership of a dwarf, for example, or something like that. But I think it would be fun to include them, because I think the only thing is then when you start opening up dwarves to magic, do you begin to water down kind of what is the true essence of a dwarf army? And maybe that's why they didn't go there, and they kind of just make them kind of a bit more generic. So I don't know, but I think gnomes are cool. In RPGs, I always like gnomes anyway. Okay. Is that everything that we were going to talk about? All the races?
We were going to talk about all the races. We're going to talk about some of the beasts.
That's right. Oh, Jeremy, the beasts have got me really excited. Some of them are so funny. And the first one, I'm going to scroll down now, because the first one that I want to talk about are the giant snails. And the reason why I want to talk to you about the giant snails is if I said to you, and we take out, oh my goodness, I try not to stereotype, but this book stereotypes. So if I was to say to you, what nation in our world is famed for eating snails? And then if you translated that across to the to the Warhammer, the old world, which race of people do you think then go on great snail hunts to achieve this foodstuffs?
Oh no, it's not the Bretonians, is it?
Yeah, it is. And they have hounds that sniff them out, and they go and they wag their tails and bound off into the forest. And there's a whole season where the giant snails hibernate, and the Bretonians go and harvest them for their food. But they do have to fight them in combat. They can never charge. They're slow moving, but they have a slime that is poisonous.
But I suddenly my head's just spiraled off into, because if anyone's ever seen like medieval illuminations, they always have little doodles of like knights fighting snails. I'm just thinking now of some sort of Bretonian snail slaying. That's very difficult to say. Snail slaying unit, or like a Bretonian hero famous for fighting. I don't know, like Nurgle snails or something. I think that'd be amazing.
But they are big. They're on a 40 by 40 mil base, so they're not small by any means. And we do have a giant snail in existence in the Warhammer world at the moment. Horticulus Slimax of the Nurgle battle tome. He rides into battle on the giant snail, so there is every chance. There are also giant frogs, giant leeches, giant rats, giant spiders. I mean, you name an animal and you put the word giant in front of it, and it's here.
Yeah, I wanted to sort of briefly mention the giant leech. I thought that was a wonderfully disgusting idea. It's got as being a single hit from a giant leech can suck a man dry in seconds. So they sound pretty lethal, which kind of makes sense.
They hide up trees and drop onto their victims, which gives them +5 to their initiative in the first round of combat, because you will never get the jump on one. It is always going to be just waiting for you.
No one ever looks up.
But I think that's I think that's cool for narrative play. Like if you go in somewhere, like if you go into this place, like there's a chance there might be leeches there, and then you get like just like if you could give that role to like terrain or something, I think would be very cool.
Yeah, I quite like them. The leeches dislike fire, which makes sense. They can swim through water. Yeah. Give it the creeps, but like a cool unit.
What was the other ones that I wanted to talk about? Oh, I wanted to talk about, and this is something that had a model that I didn't even realize that they had a model until I was looking at this. And this is a type of cold one. So you, Jeremy, of course, will be familiar with the cold ones because you've got cold one knights and things like that. But actually, there were cold one warhounds, which were like a smaller version. And they hunted in packs, and you would let them just kind of loose onto the battlefield, and they go around, and you'd have to fight a pack of them off, which I thought was very cool. And they did have models back in the day, though I'd never seen them until now.
No, I think that's really cool. I quite like the idea of bringing those back and like having like a dark elf beastmaster sort of like whipping them into battle to charge across the table. I think that'd be really cool.
Yeah. The frog sounded really cool as well, actually, and I've seen other models make giant frogs, and it reminded me of playing Talisman, because if anybody's played the game Talisman, which is made by Games Workshop and is set loosely in the Warhammer world, it's got the Crown of Command, which is an item that you may be familiar with. But one of the things that can happen to you in that game is that you can be turned into a frog, and then you lose all of your equipment and things like that, and you have to hop around until you get turned back. So this just made me think about that. So they are giant carnivorous frogs that live in Lustria, and they prey on just about any living animal it can fit into its accommodating stomach, including slans. So they're big enough to eat a slan, and they will often have a go at doing it. They've got poisonous skin, and the poisonous skin is used as an ingredient in blowpipe poison. So this is something, so they're actually quite sought after and quite prized. And it says also here, a tiny amount is used during the preparation of a potent pygmy beverage. So you can choose to get a little bit intoxicated, or you can use them to make poison arrows. And apparently they're very tasty. They're quite a delicacy.
I like the long sticky tongue as well to make a single strike, which is quite a nice touch.
Oh, apologies. There we go. Yeah, very, very cool. Yeah, they can use it in a shooting attack, and it is causes a strength 3 hit. But any models damaged are killed, and there's no armor saving throws. The victim is plucked from the unit and dragged into the frog's maw and swallowed.
I mean, who needs a bolt throw when you've got a giant frog?
Yeah, unit of them, bloody hell. But yeah, I mean, there are ones that do exist. Giant spiders exist, and giant rats exist, and there are swarms and things like that. Hobhounds, I think we have talked very briefly about hobhounds in other episodes. We touched on mammoths. So should we talk about mammoths? Because we said we'd like to see them come back.
Yeah, I think mammoths would be a really great inclusion. If you were going to bring back the Norse, you'd have to have something for the mammoth to go with it. And there used to be a Forge World model. I don't know if it's still being produced now. A Chaos Mammoth.
What's cool about mammoths is they were around before the Slam, because they're just really, really old and they've always been in the world in some way or another. So the war mammoths of Norska are creatures captured as infants and raised by the Norsemen to serve them. In the old world, mammoths exist within menageries and circuses where they attract huge crowds. The crew of the war mammoth frequently work as its stable hands during peacetime, earning considerable sum of money with their association with Norska's many rhubarb growers.
I just read that and I thought I had to read it again and go, what? That's so random.
So I'm assuming they're picking the rhubarb.
What do you associate more with, like, mammoths and Vikings than rhubarb? I mean,
the other thing that I like quite a lot is the description of a mammoth. And if you're going to go into a fantasy world and you're going to describe this monster, and maybe you're going to describe it from the point of view of someone who's never seen one. I mean, I sometimes think of the Romans, when they first saw an armored war elephant, what kind of mythical creature must they think it was like? And it says physique. Mammoths are very much like elephants, although larger and somewhat hairy. So I think there's a bit of work to be done now. I want to see an expansion on what on earth they've got to do with rhubarb.
I think there's a book there from the Black Library, The Rhubarb Growers, I think.
Yeah. But they've got a Hodar on the top and they can fight down. And it does 2 stomps. They cause fear. I think they almost certainly work in the same manner as the not Triceratops from the lizard men.
The other one that I kind of wanted to briefly mention was the Gorgon, being very much kind of like what you'd expect it to be, a sort of a strange blend of woman and snake, and able to sort of petrify people. But I thought this was really interesting because obviously we brought in as part of the Sisters of Cain faction for Age of Sigmar, and sort of bring the update edition for the Dark Elves, but there wasn't really a unit up until that point, even if they're quite well established in the new game.
Isn't a Gorgon in the Beastmen? Isn't it the thing that seeks out magic and carries the big waystone and is blind?
Oh, maybe. I can't remember what that's called now.
I swear that's called a Gorgon. So that's interesting in itself that I thought I knew what a Gorgon was and now I don't. A Gorgon is one of the rarest and most feared creatures of chaos. Many, it is said, live within human society unrecognized by their victims until it is too late. Others, more severely mutated, live in desolate northern wastes where they prey upon other abominations of chaos. A strange blend of woman and snake. Some have the lower body of the snake, while others appear perfectly normal, apart from a writhing mass of living snakes which grows in place of hair. The mutation is which distinguishes Gorgons, and which no Gorgon is without. Yeah, and they do have the petrifying stare. So yeah, they are back. It's interesting that they're called Gorgons, because I swear that there was something else in the Warhammer world called a Gorgon.
Can we just sort of pause just on the point of this, where it says they live within human society, unrecognized by their victims until it is too late? How does someone who has snakes for hair blend themselves into society?
But I think in society at large, I think that's it. Yeah. But maybe what I was taking from that is that they might live in some shadowy place or in the sewers or in an abandoned house or something.
I guess so.
When they come out, they will beguile their opponent, because I think they share something similar to kind of like the Sirens or the Lamia, because Lamia were always able to beguile people and make them fall in love with them. And I think you get struck by, whatever beauty or powers that they've got. And then, yeah, you're right. I don't think they're just, walking down to Waitrose every day and just like, I don't know what.
Well, I love what you've done with your hair today. It's just so frizzy. It's like wearing like a really big shawl around their head or something.
Yeah. But in Warhammer Age of Sigmar, they're called Melusai, is what they're called. The ones with the bows, anyway. So there we are. But yeah, so there you go. Who would have thought? I mean, we always talk about how multifaceted and interesting the old world was, and that all these different units that we'd like to see brought back. And often I'm just talking about bringing back the Wood Elf Chariot, which would just slam straight into a tree wherever it goes. But there is all this to it. I mean, we've talked about 6 races and all these different monsters, and we could just go on and on, really. There's even more that we could talk about here. But it was just really a really fun and kind of fascinating read because, we didn't play 3rd edition, although we remember some of the models. And we remember halflings because I used to own some and things like that. But just really interesting to see what they might bring back. So make sure you leave a comment and let us know either which you think is the most interesting, or did we miss anything out? What would you like to see back in what capacity? Would you like to see anything added to your army, or would you like to see a brand new army? I think that's just about everything, unless you have anything to add, Jeremy.
I just say it's been a really interesting trip down memory lane, just seeing how things have changed within Games Workshop over the years.
Yeah, a lot less talk about sex between the races is what I would say these days.
That's what we're taking away.
and yeah, I mean, although we did tread on that, we didn't talk about. We talked a little bit about racial stereotyping with the frogs, but of course we didn't touch pygmies, not with a barge pole. But who knows? Maybe one day. All right. Well, thank you very much for watching, everybody. This has been 9 Inch Charge. If you've enjoyed it, make sure you leave a like. If you'd like to see more like this, please subscribe to the channel, and we will catch you next time. Thank you very much for watching. Please be sure to leave a comment and let me know what you think. I do read every single comment. If you've enjoyed this video, please be sure to give it a like. And if you'd like to see more content like this in the future, please consider subscribing to the channel. And if you'd like to take the conversation even further, you can join the 9 Inch Charge Hobby Hangout group on Facebook. This is a place for us to come together as a community and encourage each other and chat about our hobby, and feel free to share your models, thoughts, ideas, or ask any questions that you may have. There's a link in the description below. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can find a link in the description to our Patreon page, or you could become a YouTube member. And you can also support the channel by using the affiliate link we have to Element Games. They have a really extensive hobby range. I'm sure you can find anything that you are looking for on there. And they also sell it at a discount to Games Workshop. And if you use the affiliate link, we get a small amount of commission back that we can use to put back into the channel. As ever, this has been 9 Inch Charge. Thank you very much for watching, and I will catch you next time.